documentation for PMs. And we have here our facilitator. Hi, Benga. Can you confirm you can hear me, please?
Yeah, hi. Hey, people. Oh, good. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you. So I'll just read through Benga's profile and you would have the floor to like take out this presentation. So Benga is a software engineer with 4 years plus of experience, specializing in backend systems for Web 2 and Web 3. Please can we give him a round of applause like with our emojis? Is currently helping develop cross-border payment solutions powered by stablecoins at Accrue. Benga has worked on experimental crypto system in Ethereum ecosystem. Wow, optimizing them for better user experience. Outside of work, he loves fast cars and enjoys staying updated on the latest in the automotive world. So please let's welcome Benga to today's webinar with our emojis. Hi, Benga.
Hey,
Welcome
guys.
to welcome to the webinar. You have the floor now. And
All
hi
right.
guys, before Finger takes over, if you have any questions, please don't forget to drop it in the chat box or use the Q&A option or raise your hand after the call to ask your questions. Finger, you can proceed now. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. So Esther already gave an introduction. I'm a software engineer. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
I can.
All right. Good. So, today's webinar is on technical writing and documentation for PMs. You might be wondering why does a PM need technical writing? So, if I'm just going to ask a quick question, did you have that question? Like, did you feel like why do you as a PM need technical writing, or like why do you need to worry about API documentation? If that's like a question you have, you can just like put that in chat box. I'll attend to it later. So when we talk about technical writing, I mean, it could be a bunch of stuff: API documentation, developer guides, tutorials, knowledge base articles, and technical reports. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to touch base on API documentation mostly, and talk a little bit about guides, developer guides, and tutorials. But what I'm going to talk about is going to suffice for everything else. So yeah, let me just give a quick recap of what I mean by all of these points. I mean, API documentation, it's a documentation for an API. So this context is mostly if you're working on a product that is an API, and then in that scenario, that is a product that you are in charge of. So in that scenario, your customers are developers or other stakeholders that would want to read the documentation to decide if they would use your product or not. And developer guides and tutorials are sort of walkthroughs, tutorials on how to use your product or like just give insights on what can be done with your API. And then knowledge based articles are they could be stuff like FAQs, troubleshooting guides and all that stuff. And then technical reports are some things that like I said, in terms. If for example you have an outage in your system that affected a bunch of customers or whatnot, it's sort of best practice to after you figured out what went wrong and you fixed it, then you write a report just kind of informing the public on what happened. So some of these they are technical, they are all technical writing, they are all technical write-ups. But the nuance is that not all the audience will be technical. So for your API documentation, most of the audience will be technical anyway, developer guide. But when you have technical reports, knowledge base articles, they won't all your audience won't all be technical. So you need to know how to write for a technical a technical write up for both a technical audience and not a non-technical audience. So yeah, I'm just going to move on, continue with API documentation, and let's talk about why it matters. Like I said earlier, for if your product is an API, so for example, I'm just going to like mention a random company. Let's say take Flutterwave, for example, they have an API. Um, most of developers that use their APIs are their customer interface. If the documentation is not easy to read or it's not clear enough, it's going to be a pain in there. Pain in It's going to be a pain for developers. So that could sort of shifts you to want to use another, to use the next best thing, even if it's not the best product. So having a great product in this sense, say that you have a great payment system, but if your API is not the best, it sort of can affect how people, it can affect how people use it. And I mean, I think Flutter really has a great ecosystem for developers and all that stuff. So yeah, I have a bunch of bullet points here. It affects adoption, time to value, support costs. I mean, yeah, all of these are a bunch of. I think I sent this slide, so I want to read through my slides. So, pardon me for that. So yeah, now let's move on to the next thing: elements of a clear, useful API doc. Like I mentioned earlier, it's important for an API documentation to be clear. One of the things that makes that developers look out for in the documentation is how can I authenticate? I have this API documentation. First of all, how am I going to authenticate my system with it to be sure that it's working? What can I do with it? What are the use cases? What are the nuances? What should I look out for? And what kind of endpoints can I call? How can I be rate limited? All these are sort of technical things I'm sort of walking through where we are going. So these are things that are useful in terms of how you can judge if an API documentation is clear. And now you ask, why do you need to care about stuff like this? Let's be honest, right? Devs are not going to really care about user experience in that aspect, especially backend devs, because in most cases, your backend guys are going to be the one exposing the APIs that you want to. If you are working in a product that's exposing the public API, your backend guys are the ones that write the documentation in code. But you as a product manager, you need to also understand the technical side of things to be able to drive them for quality, because one, you have the perspective of a non-dev, so you should be able to like point out, like, okay, this might look okay for a dev that already has context on this product to like integrate. But when you're giving an API to the outside world, nobody has context on what the code looks like. You just want to be able to use it. So that's an important perspective when you're working on API documentation. So as a PM, an important I think PM should advocate for good documentation. Now, for larger organizations, that they have a role called developer advocate, which usually commonly is they are the ones that tend to drive this sort of things, right? Where you have tutorials on the website, good API documentation. It might seem like it's not a job for a PM, but I think PM should really step up to that challenge and understand a little bit of the technical side of things to some of these lingos. And for example, I mentioned authentication, authentication and authorization, API keys or tokens. Like you could ask, what are these things? So what you can think of it, authentication as well. How do I log into this backend, right? So it's like, rather than a user interface where I can put in my credential to sign up, on the back end, if I want to integrate with a third party system, I need some credentials. But believe it or not, I've seen some APIs where it's not clear how to authenticate. The documentation doesn't exactly say what I need to authenticate to it. And some cases, there are some products that require you to write an email to I mean, probably to the founder. I understand it for smaller, for like, I mean, startups and smaller teams. It might be a way to get a sense of what people want to use the product for, but it just adds an added friction. So like that's a bit of a nitpicking anyway. But I'm just trying to drive on the point why it is important to have a clear API documentation. And yeah, so moving on to next thing, how we can leverage AI and documentation tools. So essentially, this, I mean, AI now is a rage, right? Everyone uses AI. People use AI to build stuff. So like, why do we need, if you can use AI, why do you need to really bother about technical intricacies of these things? I've been using AI for quite, I mean, not a long time, but like I'm using it in my work, and I can tell you that it's not what it seems on Twitter. People are going to tell you that the AI is the odd thing now. Yeah, it is, but it's still not everything. But it has some really good use cases. For example, you could take an API documentation, feed it to the AI, and like just tell it to build something, or tell it what you want to build, and it's going to like pop give you some working code. Now, in my opinion, whatever code that is spit out for you be might not be good for production use, but that's not the point in this case. Like I mentioned here, AI tools, I mean, yeah, build proof of concept applications in plain English, useful for technical guides. So if I go back to my previous slide here, I mentioned developer, what technical writing is, developer guides and tutorials. This is pretty useful in if you have an awesome API product, and then you want people to use your API. So yeah, you could just dream up ideas and write a tutorial based on the API on what developers can build with your API. And it's AI just makes your job easier because you don't have to sit down, racking your brain, learning how to code, because you don't really need to learn how to code. You just need to understand the lingo, and you don't you just when by understanding the lingo, that's like stuff like authentication keys, um when developers say they use Postman for testing, API, what an API is. Sorry, I didn't define what an API is. I assumed. But yeah, so an API simply means application programming interface, right? That's simply what it means, which means it's just an interface for you to communicate with another system. It could be a banking service, it could be a payment service, whatever it is. They all have a clear interface. They all have a clear interface that can be called from any system in any programming language. And then there's this pretty neat tool called Postman that you don't even need to write code. If you have the API documentation, you can easily make requests to the API endpoint, and then you see what it returns. This is also the advantage of having this is something also how you can drive better API documentation, because if you say you have a dev, I mean the dev team, as they've given an API in sort of a rough format, it's usable. Another dev working in the same product will understand it, but you have a different perspective, as you're not working on it as a dev. You have a different perspective, so you can push them to make it, rather than asking questions on like how does this thing work, and I mean wasting a lot of productive time. You could just easily make it such that while the devs are working on the API documentation, it is clear, so that someone that is not working on the product can easily understand it. So I mean, now the idea isn't for you to be able to code and understand what devs are doing, all of that stuff. Like, it's not really your job, but like it helps you to help the dev be it helps you help the dev to help the product, because like if the documentation is bad, it just affects adoption. And trust me, I've tried to use a lot of crazy non-properly documented products out there, and it is annoying to say the least. So yeah, back to using AI tools and agents. Like, there are a bunch of AI tools and agents that can be used in this scenario. Cursor is, I mean, yeah, Cursor is an IDE which might require you to install a VS Code like thing, which is not really important in this case. But there's a tool called Replit. I'm just going to put that in the chat box. Replit. Yeah, so Replit is they have an AI like an AI dev environment where you can use it to build proof of concept stuff. And yeah, it's pretty cool. So that's kind of like it with AI documentation. I mean, using AI applications and stuff. Sorry. Yeah, so let's go to user guides. Earlier I mentioned I'm going to touch base on documentation and user guides. I also mentioned using AI for writing tutorials, guides, and all of that stuff. It pretty to be honest, it's sort of like a game changer, right? Because you just need to understand what you want. Like you need to understand your end result. You don't really need to, for a start, you sort of lowers the bar. You don't really need to know what you need to do to get there. You just need to have a clear understanding of what you're trying to drive out. So yeah, so for example, now you want to write a step-by-step guide on how to integrate with your API. You can simply feed the AI agent your API, I mean your API documentation properly, clearly documented, and you have it's going to generate a lot of rough things for you as for a start. But then it starts to give you insight into how you can make it better. And it's sort of like you want to write a draft for an article. You want to write an article and you gave the you gave ChatGPT a draft of something, it gives you something else back. But then you look at it like, okay, no, this is not really quality of what I want. But then it gives you a starting point of how of how to restructure it and make it into what you want it to be. And it's also useful when when you're writing. I mean, you're writing for multiple audiences, right? And
Hi, Benga. I, Benga. I don't think we can hear you any longer. I
um,
really thought it was my network. Okay.
oh, can you hear me now? Sorry,
Oh, yeah, I can hear you. We lost you for a bit.
how about now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Where did you stop hearing? What was the last thing you heard?
Oh, the last thing was when you were talking about the structure, like writing for different audiences, and you were trying to explain.
Oh, right.
Basically,
Okay.
that's the last thing.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah, I was saying that writing for different audiences, you have some audiences that are not technical, they are not devs, they don't even they are I mean yeah, they're not devs, and you have other audiences that are developers. So when your audience is a developer, that is more of the case when you're writing like you're trying to structure your documentation for public consumption, right? Then the case where your audience is not your audiences are not developers, that's probably where you're writing sort of like a no, not even a guide, but more like a report of a post-mortem report where probably there was an outage or you're trying to explain how your product works and all that stuff. There are some you need to be able to understand the you need to be able to understand the technical details and explain it to a non-technical audience. So, for example, let's take crypto. Let's take crypto blockchain for example, right? It's pretty technical. There's a lot of technical jargons, but then there are articles out there that explain it in details to non-technical audiences or people that are not really in tune with the blockchain lingo and they understand what's going on, right? So it's sort of how to it's also sort of out like marry both audiences depending on what you're trying to write. So yeah, basically recap of all I've been saying is it's well structured API drives adoption, and PMs generally play a good like PMs play a real role in making that happen, because let's be honest, devs are going to once the product is done, once they have sort of like a working API, is sort of on to the next thing, and it's sort of on the product manager to make sure that the end product, which is in this case is the API, is really good. Because yeah, nobody cares if your product works, but if it can't be used, if it's not clear, then sort of, I won't say useless, but it becomes hard to use. And yeah, so I would open up the floor for questions. If anybody has any question,
Okay, thank you very much, Oluwagbenga. I do have a question. I do have some questions for you because I think this is like one of the topic I've been looking forward to, basically, as it relates to like writing tech, technical documentation and stuff like that, basically. So can you hear me?
I can hear. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, was someone trying to talk? Okay. All right. So, what would you say like are the key components of like a well structured technical documentations? Because I want to assume, like me, like some PMs here also do not like have a basic understanding of what's like the structure, what should even go into like your technical documentation, like that's your API documentation. And like what would you say, like based on your experience, what would you say is the typical structure of how you write like you write a documentation basically?
Yeah, go on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, so what would you say is typical structure of or key components of a technical documentation, basically?
Okay, so, yeah, the first thing is simplicity, clarity. And what do I mean by that? So what I mean by that is the building blocks should be clear. For example, going back to my slide, I mentioned I mentioned so building blocks. I mentioned authentication, then having real world examples, and then clearly stating the endpoints and URLs that should be present, that can be called. It's, it looks so obvious that like, okay, right, and you should be able to see the endpoint, but then I've seen cases where, I mean, the endpoints and requests, sure, in most cases it's just stated there, but like you don't know what request you need to make. You don't know what you're expecting. I've consumed APIs where I had to use Postman to just see the response from the API first, because their documentation doesn't state what I'm supposed to get in terms of the response, and it doesn't state what kind of errors I'm going to get if I send in this kind of data. So it's like I'm writing code, but then I'm blind. If I do something wrong, I don't know how to catch that error, because I need to sort of test the API myself first. And this is from personal experience. I've had scenarios where I had to make random calls and try and make the API fail, and then write those errors, document those errors myself in my code. Which, yeah, it's doable. It just makes it work a lot harder. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, to a large extent. But I wanted to. I thought probably like the way you write PRDs that you probably have like, oh, there's a background, there's like an objective. I thought like there's probably like a guide, or generally. I know I've read API documentations in the past, and like they vary based on what you're trying to like explain to like people in your documentation. But like, are there general guides to how you can guide your developer in writing their API documentations, basically? Like probably like there's probably like a structure of, oh, this should be this, depending on what you are trying to explain, sha, I
Okay,
guess.
yeah, I think I get what you're saying. there's no guide, there's no hard rule to say this is how API should be structured. Also, I'm just going to share another screen on sort of an example of what I think is a clear API documentation. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so yeah, this document, this is these guys, they're called Nina. It's an infrastructure company for, so yeah, I'm just, Farcaster is a social network protocol used on crypto, blah blah blah. Now the irony is Farcaster themselves, their API documentation is annoying, right? But these guys have they built an infrastructure on it, and it's easy. So what I was trying to say about clear structure is their API, their API, I didn't, okay, so I didn't mention this, but it's in the slide, versioning, right? You have version 1, version 2. They made it clear that, right, this is they are currently on version 2, and each entity that is available on the API is in its own separate section, right? So if I want to fetch a user information, it's clear, I can see that, right? If I need stuff based on, if I need some things that is related to a user, I come here, I can see I can see individual sections clearly. And then it's, okay, I think I'm not logged in. It's if I was, okay, yeah. They also have a sort of like a playground thing where I don't need to even use a tool like Postman. I don't need to write code to test out the API. I can do all of this on their websites with dummy values. So it's more like it's a bit more in, this is, I mean, this is a lot more intensive, I mean extensive in terms of building, but there are also open source tools that help with these, right? One of them is, I can't remember, I think Swagger. Yeah, so this is basically just slapping a nice UI on top of a tool like Swagger that has like a they have an open source UI which is very rough, but this is a nice UI on top of that kind of stuff. So the advantage of having a clearly documented API. For contrast, I'm going to open up Farcaster's documentation. I'm going to open up Farcaster's documentation, and it- things are not as clear as, so let me share, let me, a sec. So so can you see, yeah, so this is another documentation for the same protocol, for the same protocol, but like it's a lot more complicated. I don't know, can everyone hear me?
Yes, yes, you're audible.
Okay, so what I'm just trying to say here is this is a lot more, personally, this is a lot more complicated to look at. I mean, I've worked with it, so I sort of understand it better now. But initially, the first time I went to try to like go through their docs, it was like they don't want you to use it. And then there's also something, because their API, or something I saw while using this, they had some hidden API documentation that wasn't on their public API. So I had to do a bit of extra digging to find a Notion page that had a more up-to-date thing before. So at the end of the day, I just stopped using these guys. And I mean, yeah, they charge. I could have used this for free, right? Hosting my own thing and using it for free. But then it was just a very annoying experience. So the difference here is this has a more structured, for example, so yeah, what I was saying about structure, each resource that is available in the, I think that's the word I should have used. Each resource that is available in the API is clearly documented out in its own separate section. So you have your user entity, a bunch of things that, yeah, so you could think of a class like a tweet. So everything is Twitter also, yeah, I would have gone through Twitter's API documentation, but it's there's a bunch of I think you need to pay to be able to access documentation now. So yeah. So does this sort of does it answer your question in terms of structure?
Yes, it does. I think there's like more clarity as to what you mean. Thank you. All right. I don't know. Does anybody have a question? You can drop it in the chat box. You can raise your hand so Benga can answer the questions. All right. PIP of that's Bridget. Hi Bridget, you have some questions.
Yeah, hi Benga, thank you so much and well done. The session has been very insightful, but I do have a question. So while you were talking, I think lots of times you mentioned about like the documentation not, properly telling you what you should do, and then like the catering for the different errors. If I use this, I'm going to get like a 201 or 200.
So I kind
I'm
of
not
lost.
getting a response and all of that. And all those. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, but I lost you when you were talking about the error response.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, my network's a bit, yes. So I was basically trying to point out that you mentioned about you mentioned vague documentation, basically where some things are not properly spelled out, they are not clear enough, some things are missing. So my question is, how then do we know when to stop, basically, like when you're trying to ensure that the document is well detailed versus when it's now maybe too in-depth or too granular to the point where is just annoying reading it to because if you have to spend a whole lot of time, I don't know if you get the question, like how do we then know how to strike that balance between it being too vague and being too explicit or being too open.
Okay, yeah, I think I get it. Yeah. Yeah, so I think the most important thing is to make sure that all the basics are covered. And what do I mean by basics are covered? I mentioned um request and response. So let me use, I'm just going to use this guy as a guinea pig once more to make my point clear. So, yeah, so can you see my screen?
Yes, it's clear. We can see
Yeah.
it. I can see. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, so one thing what I mean by having the basics covered is, as a developer, I want to consume these endpoints. I want to know how to search for usernames. So now I have this URL here. I have this URL here. The question that comes to my mind is, how do I use this URL? Do I use query parameters? Query parameters are like things you have in the URL path and all that stuff. Or do I make a get request with a body, right? So like now this API spells it out clearly that, like, okay, yeah, you there's the use query parameters, the variables and the values. What kind of variables do you pass in? The type, because there are some APIs that don't really spell some of these things out, and they just expect you to. You don't know if you're supposed to pass in a string or a number or whatever. And then there are also examples of how the request will look like in, I mean, multiple languages. But this is sort of extra icing on the cake. It doesn't really, the actual examples is sort of, say you want to go the extra mile. But the basics is, I want to know what I'm sending to the API in what format am I sending it, and then what am I getting in return? What does the response look like? So this response, right? This response object here is very important to developers because it's like how this is how I'm going to structure my own code to know what I'm getting in return. But then, and this is a successful response, 200. It's also important to know what I should be getting if there's a failure. So am I getting a structured response or I'm just getting a string? This I've seen APIs that don't the documentation doesn't say anything about this. So then if you don't test it yourself as a developer, it's very easy to have to do double work where you've written the code and then you have to go back and add some extras. So does that answer your question, Bridget?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
All right, cool.
Yeah, thank you, Gbenga. I think some people, the quite a number of people have their hand raised. So I will just look at it based on those. So Aselim, do you want to like go ahead and ask a question now?
Yes. The last time we calculated the 5,550. Yes.
Hi, Abdul. Please can you? Thank you. Hi, Aselim. Can you hear me? Okay, if Asalim is not available, I think we can take Andy. Adi, if I got your name correctly.
Okay, good evening, everyone.
Hi, good
Thank
evening.
you. Okay, thank you so much for the information, time, and efforts. I really appreciate what you people are doing, though I am new in this group. But my question or suggestion will be, if possible, if we can have the document and also the recording of the program today. So I don't know whether if that could be possible. That's what I'm appealing for, please. Thank you.
I I thank you very much, Adi, first off. And welcome to the community. It's so good to have you on call basically with us today. So yeah, the recording will be uploaded on our YouTube, so you can always go back to it. And Benga has also shared the slides. I would ask him if he'll be able to share this API documentation, probably the link or something with us. If that's possible, then we'll also have that on the resource channel.
Yeah,
I hope I answered the question. Benga, will you be able to share it? Like you want to share it now
yeah,
on chat box or
I'll
something?
share it as well.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, hi
Okay.
Michael.
Sorry,
Can we have
sorry, sorry,
okay?
sorry. Before you close, what is the YouTube name, please?
People in product, just look for people in product.
The same name. Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
the same
Thank you,
name, people in product.
thank you,
Thank you. I'll also
thank
look
you.
for the link and try to share. And
Okay.
Bridget, if you can help with that, please, while we go ahead. Thank you. Hi Michael. I think I can go ahead and ask your question now.
Okay, hi, good evening, everybody. So, while I understand the use of APIs and then how to test out APIs, I'm just wondering, is it that PMs are now required to, document APIs, which ordinarily, so far in my experience, is meant to be the function of the backend engineer? I'm just wondering, you know, what essentially this session is supposed to teach us, because PMs generally we are supposed to be focused on the customers. So how is learning about APIs, which is a function of the backend engineer, how does that benefit me as a product manager? That would be my question. Thank you.
All right, that's a good question. Yeah, so the point of this is now if you're working on a product where let me rephrase that. If you're working in a company in an organization where the product you are working on is an API, now that will make your customers to be primarily developers and other companies that want to use your API. So if you leave the duty of the API documentation to be solely the developer's responsibility, that is going to affect the quality of the documentation itself, because now what a developer considers, for example, if I was writing code, right, and then I'm writing the code for another person on my team to use, I don't need to. I'm just going to like write the bare minimum documentation for say the front end for say the front end team. They have some context on what is being built, right? So it's easy. They've seen Figma mockups, designs, so they have some context on like, okay, and then they can ask questions because we're on the same team. But now the people that will be consuming your API are not on your team. They are probably in another country, right? So you want there to be as little friction as possible to consuming your API. So now the API in this context isn't an API for your front end guys to consume, but this is what your company is putting out there. So take Flutter Wave or Paystack, for example, right? Developers use their, let me not developers, other companies, other startups rely on their API documentation. Now, if the API documentation is not clear, or say they move to a different API, a different version, and they fail to inform their customers and all that stuff, there's going to be a problem, because if your API if you are deprecating your API, let's say you are setting some endpoints, but it's not clearly stated in your documentation. If somebody comes to your documentation to want to integrate that stuff, and they don't know that probably something changed, or there's something that's missing, then their experience is not going to be good, and it's going to affect retention rate, and like, okay, nobody's going to want to stick to that product, which is why you tend to see these companies do stuff like hackathons trying to get people to use their API when I remember, I think, if I'm clear, I know a bunch of companies do hackathons just to get people to use their API. And now this also has an added benefit. They can get direct feedback from these developers using their API newly launched, and then they can refine documentation better. So the point of getting feedback isn't to make the API itself better. The API already does what it's supposed to do, but the documentation needs to be clear, so that you don't want to be getting on calls every now and then explaining how to use your API to customers. That's just like waste of your own time. So it's best to have a clear documentation. And yeah, so why I think product managers should drive this. No, I'm not saying product managers should write the documentation, but I think product managers should drive this because they are the product managers, quote unquote. They manage the product, and the product is the API. So does that answer your question?
Okay, so in essence, because I want to be sure that I get what we are discussing, right? In essence, okay, because I understand that for every product, there is a quality assurance person, right? And this QA is supposed to test this API. And at the end of the day, based off of the requirement that's been documented by the product manager, you are expected to have 200 all the way, right? To be sure that the API is working as expected. Your response is supposed to be 200. And where it is 400 or otherwise, you are then going to check the response to understand what the error is, right? So again, is it not conflicting that a PM, okay, no, the question is, are we now supposed to be testing APIs, or the QA is supposed to test the API and then report on whether or not the response is 200 or is 400 or is any other response outside of what it's supposed to get? Because for me, if I have to go and test APIs again, I'm also, let's say I'm doing somebody else's work, and that person is the QA who is supposed to test these APIs and then share feedback. But if it's just I test it, and then I'm saying, request body, do input this, and then click on send, check the response and all. I need to be sure what it is that I am trying to do in this instance. I don't know if you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I get what you're trying to say. So yeah, it's not about you testing the APIs. Now that is when that's during development phase, right? But we're talking about when the API is done, it passed QA, but now you want to expose it out to the world. It's not for the API is not for your internal consumption, it's for everybody else to consume, right? So what you are doing is not the key in this sense. It's not about if the API returns 200 when it's supposed to return 200 and returns 400 and it should return 400. It's about, if you look at the documentation, is it clear what I am to send to the API to get the required response? Is it clear what I'm expecting as a response? I don't know if you get so. So there's a comment here from Chuzo.
Okay.
Essentially,
Yeah, I was about to up with that out. So let me just add to what Benga is trying to say, Moses. We are not supposed to write documentation as product managers, and we're not supposed to ensure that if your API is probably an API that is going to be consumed by the public, whatever documentation you are providing or your developers are providing is clear, there's clarity, like they're able to understand what the API should do, what errors should show up, how it should function, basically. Like it gave an example of Paystack while he was talking. That Paystack has an API that people consume and integrate with their website, right? And they have a documentation. Like I said, I've gone through Paystack documentation. I could understand what it was supposed to do. I could easily understand what they were trying to explain from the documentation. You as a PM, it's your job to ensure that whatever you're giving out to the public from your products is usable, it's clear, and it's like people do not have issues. You don't have to get on like multiple customer calls to before they can understand what you're trying to say to them. Because when people don't understand your product, then you have drop-offs, there's churn rates, right? So that's in essence what Benga is trying to say. You're not supposed to understand, or probably you just want to ensure that whatever documentation you're putting out to the public is clear, and there's a good structure to it, and it does what it's supposed to do. I don't know if you want to add to that because you have your hand raised.
Yes, I wanted to add to that. I wanted to help. Would I say help? I wanted to add to what Benga was trying to pass across, right? So, a few foundations. It's always good to have skills, right? You pick it up here and there, whether you are adept in it or whether you have. Oh, I'm echoing. Hello?
I can hear you, Chibuzo.
Okay. Okay, yeah, whether you're adept in it or whether you have working knowledge in it, right? It helps you. Yeah. So, and there are different angles to this. You do not, there are different PM work based on the companies that you are working in. Customer facing, B2C, B2B, you are building infrastructure, you're a provider. Yeah.
Yeah.
You might want to get into that kind of PM work in the future. But if your company is providing API docs for your customers, either you are providing infrastructure, maybe you're a platform, you're a NIBS, you're a Flutterwave, or you're a provider, right? If you leave your what's it called now? The experience of your API documentation to your backend engineers, you're shooting yourself in the foot, because if backend engineers themselves would not like to use an API documentation that is not usable or is not good. But when they are churning it out themselves, they give the least effort to it. They always give the least effort to it. Like I posted earlier, some will just give you a Postman documenter doc, shabbily done, not a lot of information there, right? Like Esther said, as a PM, when people are seeing that shabbily done documents, API document in the public, they would think about the product manager. First of all, you're the one that's going to be talking to whoever it is, either in events, hackathons, and all that, right? So it's good to what I'm getting from this session is to know what a good and usable API doc looks like. You might not be doing it now, you might not be interfacing with it now. You might be solely a PM that works on a product and you're only interfacing with the front end. That's fine. But there's the back end. There are products that are back end heavy. There are products that are you can only use. There's no front end for it, right? And then there are cases where maybe you now have to play the role of a technical PM, right? You need to know these things. So I don't know if I've been, and then if you don't have an in-house technical writer, some companies have in-house technical writers, right? They have in-house technical writers that can write these documents. If you don't have one, then a collaboration between a PM that knows what this document should look like, what this document should have, and a backend engineer will form a very solid team.
Yeah, so exactly. Chibuzo, you nailed it right on the head. So, essentially, right. The whole point is the whole point of this is, as a PM, you're bringing a different perspective. You're not the one that built the API, so you are not. While you work in the same company, it's your company, but then you're bringing a different perspective of having nothing. You don't have a working knowledge of how the API works. Even though you've read PLDs and all that stuff, but like you didn't write the code, so it's an advantage to you because then you won't be making assumptions that somebody should because like it's a very easy assumption that okay, you should be able to like just see this postman. You just look at the postman doc and you can see what it does. But like you don't have that. You not working on the product right at the low level, you don't have that assumption. So you can easily see that, right, this thing, I don't understand what it's right, what it is. Like, you need to make it clearer. Do you get it now, Michael?
Yes. It's clear because my initial assumption was that it's about, so when we narrowed it down to SAS, it now began to make sense to me, because initially my thinking was that it applies to every product and every PM, but having narrowed it down to an ACS, it now makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm good now. Thank you very much, Chibuzo and Wida. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. We have one more question here in the chat box, and that will be it for today. So, Olagbenga, Elizabeth is asking, what's the difference between APIs, middleware, microservices, and webhook? Do you want to answer that, even though it's like outside the topic of today? And what should PMs know about them?
So APIs, like I mentioned earlier, APIs, it's an acronym for application programming interface, which it's just like an API is an interface for you to communicate between a system and another system. It could be a front end or a back end or two back ends. Now, middleware, microservices, webhooks, these are, I would say they are lingos. They can all be called services, but they just do different things. So, for example, a middleware, you could have a middleware that does authentication. You could have a middleware that does validation. In a lot of cases, a middleware doesn't have a middleware could be a full service on its own, which means it's sitting on another server, or it could just be part of the code. So think of a middleware as a middleman that sits between the request and the server. Then microservices, microservice is like an architecture pattern where you have your backend split into multiple services that does different things. So microservices are let me think of a better way to analyze a better analogy. So think about you have a restaurant, right? And then you have different people doing different things. You have the waiter, the cook or the chef, or the cook, the chef, or whatever. Now that's sort of like a microservice architecture, because everybody doesn't do the same thing. But when you have a situation where you have one person taking the orders, the same person making the food, the same person serving you, there's a name for it. That's called the monolith. That is where your backend system is just one piece of software on the server that handles all the requests. Everything from authentication, validation, the business logic, everything sits on the monolith. But then a microservice splits the individual parts of the system, authentication, even the business logic itself could be split into multiple microservices. This is common in large organizations. Like, larger organizations tend to use a microservice architecture for a lot of their services, because for whatever reason, when they have like a larger workforce, it it makes sense for them to split different teams working on separate services, and they don't have to bother with everybody else. And a webbook is sort of like a notification mechanism. So you think about it as okay, so a quick example is when you sign up to a service and then you get an OTP on your phone. So that's a form of notification, right? That's a form of notification. So in this case, a webhook is a way to notify another server when something is done. So I'm going to try and give a real life example, but it might not work. So bear with me. Yeah. So just think of a webhook as a way to communicate with another server without maintaining a connection. So okay, now if you understand the response request cycle, you send a request to a server, you wait for a response. But there are cases where you can't wait for a response. For example, Flutterwave, Paystack, they use webhooks, right? In the case of you have a product where you are using Flutterwave or Paystack to process payments. Now you send the request off to Paystack or Flutterwave to process the payment, but that payment will not be processed immediately. It takes a while, maybe not a long while, but there's a bit of delay, right? But you need to return a response to your own customer. So you can say return when you send the request off to Flutterwave or Paystack. That's callback here is an example of a webhook. So yeah, that request is successfully sent, so you know that you're going to get a response, but don't return it. You just return a pending status into your customer, and then you have a callback URL that is registered on Paystack's server. They send the response of your initial request to that callback URL. So it's sort of like you're consuming their API, then you register a URL on your own server from your own server on their system for them to send notifications to. So you send a response, you send a request, then instead of them sending the request immediately, there's sort of like a delay. Then they send the response to that callback URL, and with the ID and all that stuff on how you can. I mean, webhooks are like a lot of things. It's a big deal on its own. You have to make sure it's secure. You have to be sure that you're getting the right webhook response for the right request. So there's a bunch of other details that are sent back. But the bottom line is webhooks are a notification mechanism between two backend systems, essentially. Does that answer your question, Elizabeth? Okay, so you say what should a PM know about them? Yeah, so you don't need to know how webhooks work in details. I mean, it's good if you can explain it, right? Then developers they aren't going to what's the term now? Bamboozle you or whatever. So what you should just know about these things is they are all systems, and knowing how they work. I think knowing how they work is a knowledge that you would not regret knowing. Like I know it can be complicated, but then you you're not really building it out, so you just having the knowledge of how these things work, what a middleware is. Say, for example, you have a in my own personal experience with middlewares, I have no I've middlewares are usually in my codes, right? So they are, the server is getting a response. I'm going to have a middleware somewhere that authenticates. It's essentially sits between the the route that the request is the URL. Then I'm going to use a middleware to check if this response, if where this response is coming from, I want to check if it is authenticated, if it is valid, if it's a valid response before even attending to it at all. So it's also middlewares are also actually useful in APIs because there's this thing in APIs called rate limiting, right? So it's like you have an API based on you have different plans. That's like a pricing tiers for your APIs, and each pricing tier has different rate limits. So let's say the lowest tier has a 400 requests per minute rate limit. In this scenario, you could use a middleware to sit between all requests and the actual API endpoint that counts how many requests is coming in per minute. Then once it hits that limit, you have to return I can't remember the error code, but it's an error code that's returned in that scenario that you're sending too many requests. I think it's 4 to 1 or can't remember. So that's an example where like all of these things, right? They are all in a sense APIs because a middleware also it's sort of like an interface between a communication interface. Microservices communicate via an API because they have to communicate. The webhook also is an API. Right. So they are all understanding how they are related is important, and understanding the differences is important. So I think that should answer your question, Elizabeth. Am I
Yeah.
correct?
Wow, well, it's been a very, very insightful session, and we are actually way behind time. But thank you very much, everyone, for asking questions. Thank you, Benga, for coming on here to like teach us about API and documentation. I'm sure like everybody has taken one or two away from me, and definitely going forward they will know how to, when you're in face with that kind of situation, you're able to understand what to do and how to navigate the situations, right? Thank you everyone for coming here to the PIP's webinar. This happens every second and last Thursday of every month. And we also have other events like the group mentorship sessions and the interview prep session that happens interchangeably every Tuesday, and also our weekly check-in calls that happen bi-weekly. That's twice in a month, and that should be coming up upon next week. That's not the Saturday, like that's next week Saturday. And on this note, I would like to draw the curtain here and say thank you guys for coming, and see you on Tuesday. And do enjoy the rest of your nights and your weekend. Bye everyone. Thank you, Gbenga. And yes, sorry, you could join the Slack channel if you're new to the to PIP. Just join the Slack channel through the link that was dropped by Bridget. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you, Gbenga.
Thank you for having
Yeah,
me.
I will be touched. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Bridget, you can stop recording now. Thank you.